Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker, and this is the place where we talk about all things Japanese politics. This is episode 3, Japan and Donald Trump. Now, we're going to be talking about domestic issues today. Of course, Prime Minister Ishiba was confirmed. A number of other things have happened. There was a bit of a scandal with the DPP. We're going to get on to any other news as well. But I think big ticket item you have to talk about, reason everyone's been paying attention to this week in the news. Donald Trump's back. What does that mean for Japan? Now he's got his 2 terms, which means you have to talk about the 2 T's, which are tariffs and Taiwan. But first, just a bit of a brief overview. Donald Trump, in case you've been living under a rock the last week, he's got his big victory, despite all the polls saying it would be, and all the pundits saying, oh, it's going to be quite close. It's hard to tell. He's won quite handsomely in the Electoral College, and he's won the popular vote for the first time. So quite a big victory for him. And that's left markets reacting in many ways positively in areas they expect Trump to be good for, and people scrambling, thinking, oh, what's this going to mean for individual countries? What's the knock-on effect going to be in a few months when he gets actually his hands on power? Something to think about in terms of the Japan context is that Shinzo Abe, who we've talked about before, enjoyed a very good relationship with Trump. I think he was the first foreign leader to visit Trump. They went golfing together, and they're meant to have enjoyed quite a good relationship. I saw a post the other week on Twitter talking about how an insider apparently said that Trump still has fond memories of Abe and misses working with him, which is, to be honest, quite nice. And it's nice to hear people talking. I sort of have nostalgic memories of Abe being the first sort of prime minister I really learned about and was quite aware of, so it's sort of quite nice. And then, of course, now you have to think, what's Ishiba going to do? What's his relationship with Trump going to be like? And I've already seen plenty of jokes on the internet about how he's frantically practicing his golf swing because Abe and Trump had quite a good relationship on the golf course. They spent a lot of time out there to sort of endear himself to Trump. Obviously, Ishiba, of course, has done what you'd expect, and he's congratulated Trump on his victory. And we'll have to see how that develops and how their relationship grows from here. So on to the first possible implication of Trump and Japan, which is Taiwan and the effect on sort of global Southeast Asia. Now, historically, Trump's always been sort of an anti-war person. I remember when he ran for the first time for the Republican nomination, he talked a lot about his dislike of the Iraq War, which put Jeb Bush, who was running against him, in a very uncomfortable position. And he's always been sort of an anti-war person. I don't think he had a major war during his term. And there is an expectance that he'll have that sort of isolationist anti-war stance again. I've not seen anything to indicate otherwise. So that, in terms of China potentially having designs on taking more sea power, expanding its reach, and even sort of murmurs you've heard over the last few years that they might move towards Taiwan and looking to retake the island, could potentially, if you have an isolationist president who doesn't want to get involved, that's a big problem for a Taiwan perspective, and possibly from a Southeast Asian Japanese perspective, what the implications of that could be. But then on the other hand, in some ways, Trump was sort of not afraid to get tough with China. I remember Chris Chappell, who runs the China Uncensored YouTube, I think he gave him something like an A rating in terms of standing up to China, just because he called them out and was willing to get into a tariff war with them. And we'll come on to tariffs in a minute. And Trump is very much projecting his sort of strongman persona. I don't think he'd want to be seen as overseeing a massive, clear fall in grace for the United States abroad and its power. And he was very, very keen to call out Biden and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, how that went wrong, and the Ukraine war. So it's hard to say, because I don't think he'd necessarily want to be seen as weak in that way, even if he's not as very clear as Biden's said different things about China and Taiwan over the years, but he has at times been willing to say we will respect Taiwan's independence, and even we might get involved if something goes down. So Trump hasn't been that clear. He's given himself that wiggle room, but it's hard to imagine he'd want to be seen as weak on this issue, even if he is seen as a very anti-war isolationist person. I guess the big factor is how much the X factor is how much does China really want Taiwan? How much are they really going to call his bluff? And perhaps this might play into how the tariffs play out if they're particularly wounded, if the Chinese Communist Party feels undermined by the tariffs, if they're suffering and they need to sort of project dominance and strength. They might look to Taiwan if they feel Trump is distracted and not willing to go the whole way and intervene. They might see that as a potential way to do that. But again, would they really be willing to call his bluff in that respect, given how unpredictable Trump has been? It's very hard to say. I think how he handles Ukraine could be very pivotal in this. If he's seen as, he's very much said, oh, in the first 24 hours, whatever, I'm going to rapidly negotiate a ceasefire. I don't want to be involved in a Ukrainian war any longer. And he's very much been against continued US involvement there and spending lots of money on supporting Ukraine. He wants a negotiated truce. But I think he's going to want it, I would imagine, in a way that makes him look good, makes him look like the savvy dealer, after the deal, all that stuff. He's not going to want to look at like he's just conceding whatever the reality is. He's going to want it to look like a win. If it doesn't come across that way, and if China, who have very close relations with Russia over the years at times, if they perceive him as just having given in and giving Russia what they want and letting them get away with something, that could be very much play into their mindset in how they treat Taiwan, and also we could have a knock-on effect into how other countries see it, how much they're willing to stand up behind the US, and just generally how strong the USA is perceived. So how Ukraine plays out could be absolutely pivotal. On to the second T, tariffs. Trump has pledged very much to raise tariffs. He's even looking at potentially as a way to raise revenue, and he's even hinted that he might even get rid of the income tax and that he might use tariffs on goods coming into the USA as like an alternative way for the government to raise federal revenue. And he wants to potentially use that as a way to bring jobs, manufacturing back to the USA as well, and in some ways improve their economy there, although it would raise costs. And he's talked about imposing something like a 60% tariff on China. So if he did impose that just on China, never mind imposing tariffs on other countries, possibly even Japan, without even getting into that conversation, that would have knock-on effects, obviously, on the economy, on how Japanese and Chinese companies do business, and the cost of the way many Japanese companies run, and it would have a knock-on effect on the Japanese economy and the price of the yen. And the yen, I think, has had a little bit of a scare post the Trump election as well. Now, it could just be that this is a bluff, that he might not go the full way with China, and this is just something he's considering, and this might play into Taiwan, and sort of Trump seeing China as a threat. Perhaps this is just like a talking point to sort of put them in check, and it's a card he'll play. There's also been talks that this tariff policy might not be extended to everyone. There's been talk in the UK of, Trump's got an affection for the United Kingdom, the special relationship. Now, this could just be code for people wishful thinking, but there's been talk that the UK might get some sort of let-off and might not have like strict tariffs applied to them, at least as strict as there might be on some countries like China. You could possibly see the same thing with Japan. There's been historically close ties, strategic relationships, the use of US military weapons and staff stationed in Japan. There's a sort of very supportive relationship that's benefited both countries to an extent. But we have seen leaders get tough with Japan before, like Nixon, who didn't like the sort of dominance of the Japanese economy. And you could see that maybe this is sort of a gambit from Trump. Perhaps this is just like with China, it could potentially be a bluff, and maybe he'll want something back from Japan to sort of extend a favourable non-tariff trading relationship. Perhaps he wants them to buy more US military equipment, or just to have favourable relations continue. But it's very hard to know, and it's very unpredictable, of course. And there may be, in some respects, also positives for this. If there's not harsh direct tariffs on Japan, you might see some opportunities as suppliers who would normally get their goods from China. There might be opportunities for sort of savvy companies in places like Japan to sort of fill the gap if they market themselves correctly and play their cards right. But obviously, as I say, there's very big risks for many companies in the Japanese economy of tariffs on China and the knock-on effects. This really, again, is just very hard to predict and which way this will go. My suspicion is that this will be a long, drawn-out story, and we'll have to see how it plays out. And I think this could just be like sort of a roadblock or a small complication in the sort of the long-term trend of the Japanese economy and the issues they're facing, which is a coupling of a aging society, low population growth and low births, coupled with a lack of growth. I think those are the big stories in the Japanese economy long term, and this is just a situation to be navigated in the short term, but we'll have to see how that plays out and what happens with the Japanese economy and successors to Trump and the successors to Ishiba and how this relationship develops. Not to sound too much like a cop-out, but it's just very hard to predict, but these are the sort of the factors I think might be at play, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this relationship between Ishiba, Trump and the Japanese economy develops over time. Now back to domestic issues in Japan. Ishiba was confirmed as Prime Minister this week, so congratulations to him. We wish him good luck. He's certainly going to need it given the fragmented nature of any sort of coalition or minority government he runs and how splintered the Japanese parliament is. But nonetheless, he's, in a way, his gamble of calling an election has paid off in a sense. He's back in as Prime Minister still under difficult circumstances. I cover this in some detail in a short video on my YouTube, so for those listening on to the podcast, you can find us on the Japan Politics podcast on YouTube, and you can sort of see short videos and summaries. But to go over it quickly, what happened is roughly what I thought would occur. The LDP and Komeito voted for Ishiba in a sort of runoff vote to become Prime Minister. And this happens because there's a hung parliament, no party has a clear majority, and therefore there's a runoff election. And I believe this is the first time it's happened in Japan in about 30 years there's been a runoff like this. But because there's no clear majority, you have to have a vote to see who has the most support. Now, no candidate got enough votes in the first round to have a majority. What happened was Ishiba, like I say, he got his votes from Komeito and the LDP, 215. But I think he got a few more, 221. And then the Constitution Party came second in the first vote. I think they got 151 votes. Now, what happened? I had a bit of a look. I couldn't see anywhere like a breakdown of what specific members in the House of Representatives who voted for who. But what I believe happened is that all of the parties other than the governing parties, Komeito and the LDP and Constitution, who were sort of styling themselves as the main opposition, they weren't willing to get behind any other candidate. So Ishin, the DPP, Reiwa, none of these, the new Sanzito, etc., the Communist Party, none of these wanted to be seen as either propping up the LDP and keeping them government, and they were also wary of getting into sort of a fragile grand coalition with the Constitution Party running the show. It would be very hard to negotiate that with so many parties involved, given how many of them would have to group up to get to 233. And it would be sort of very difficult. And you'd also have to explain to your voters why you're propping up the Constitution Party who you ran against. So it's very difficult. So what they did was to take the safe route, not vote for the LDP, not vote for the Constitution. All these parties who were not involved in government and weren't the main opposition, they just voted for themselves, even knowing that obviously their leader had no chance of becoming the Prime Minister realistically. The only people looking at the vote that I suspect did either vote for the LDP or Constitution is there's a group of 12 independent representatives, and based on the math and looking at who likely voted for themselves, I think it's quite possible that some independents, I think around 6, went for the LDP for whatever reason, and a few went for Constitution, which is why they got slightly more than the amount of seats they had. And I think also, based on the maths I did, I think the SDP, because it seems that every party voted for themselves and you can see the total number of votes, I think it's likely, although I can't guarantee this, that the SDP voted for either LDP or Constitution, and they just have one seat. My suspicion is they went for the Constitution Party because they've got some historic ties there, and I don't know if they'd suddenly just back the LDP, but that's just a hunch. In any case, because of that, LDP was the biggest bloc, but they didn't get to 233, and then in the second round, there was broadly the same result. The LDP got 221 votes, and hey presto, the LDP were in as the biggest party, even if they didn't have that majority of 233. The parties weren't willing to coalesce and get together and get behind the Constitution Party, and so by default LDP got in as a minority government. So we'll have to see how Ishiba does from there on out, but he's in. His gamble's paid off. He's back in as the Prime Minister again, and good luck to him, as we say. So where do we go from here? What's Ishiba going to do? Well, in terms of when he ran for election and statements he's made, I think his priorities, I mean, the first one's self-evident given the LDP loss of support and why this election was called in the first place. You'd think his first port of call would be to sort of clean up the image of the LDP, deal with the slush fund scandal, and reform the image of the LDP. So step number one surely is hopefully trying to hold together a stable government and get some legislation through, and sort of move on from the scandal and get people thinking about something other than that. Possibly we might see some sort of electoral reform or transparency. I can't imagine that other parties would be too opposed to that, given that it's something the LDP's taken advantage of with the slush fund. But we'll have to see, and perhaps he might face resistance from some elements within his party if he tries to institute that. But I think his big priority surely will be cleaning up the image of the LDP and moving on from these scandals. He's also talked about reforming the Japanese economy, moving out of deflation, strengthening the Japanese economy. I mean, very obvious things you'd expect, but how much he can deliver on that, we'll have to see. And he's talked about the concern with Japan's low birth rate. What steps he takes in that regard would be interesting. It's something that's been failed to address in the past. Those are his priorities, and also just forming a stable government. I mean, there's still, I believe, been discussions of the DPP, although they didn't back them in this vote and didn't to confirm him as the Prime Minister. There might be some sort of quid pro quo. They'll support them on some issues, vote with them on some bills. That's been in discussion, so that may come to pass, which would very much help in terms of stabilising the government and getting some legislation through. But then you have to ask, what are the DPP going to want in return? Remains to be seen if those talks will come off and what they'll ask for. But yeah, that could be very interesting there. His problems he'll face are quite obvious. Forming a good relationship with Trump is going to be a big priority. Like I say, the economy and just keeping his coalition together and avoiding further scandal and cleaning up the image. Basically, those are the main issues he's going to have to grapple with. And so we'll have to see how he does over time. Next item we have to discuss is there's old-fashioned sex marital affair scandal that's happened, and this has occurred concerning the DPP. They've just had a very good election, although they're one of the minor parties. We're talking about them potentially joining in the LDP to some respect. They're being a potential kingmaker on some issues. They might be in a position to have some serious leverage, and they've quadrupled their seats. They've gone up to 28 seats, which is a substantial block, a substantial increase of going up from the seats and their position they had before. So off the back of this very good election, they've now been caught in this scandal, as I say. What happened was Yuichiro Tamaki, and as always, apologies for bad pronunciations, Yuichiro Tamaki, head of the DPP, has been caught in potentially an extramarital affair. He's since admitted to it and apologised and is seeking to move on, but yeah, that's no longer in dispute. And the reports are that he was seen entering a hotel with a tourism ambassador, who not his wife, and he's apologised and is seeking to move on from there. And there's no indication, I believe, that he's looking to resign. I think he's looking to draw on with it, a line under it, and just move on, which you could see happening. But this has come out very recently, just after the election. I suppose the thing going in his favour is he's still in a very pivotal position. He's had a very good result for his party, and depending on how the parliament goes, things could be very fraught, and it's not certain how long any government will last before it has to call another election. But he's in a position of leverage, like I say, and I think it will remain to be seen. I think what a lot of people will remember is not this affair right at the beginning of the DPP's start to the parliament, but perhaps what they extract from the LDP, whether they opt to form a sort of quid pro quo government with them or not, and how much the government delivers is perhaps going to be a key thing on people's minds, particularly as this has happened right at the start. So it may be that he can weather this and still have a sort of a successful term, building on from a very good election result, going from 7 to 28 seats. But it's certainly not the start to a parliamentary term that you would want, and it's not what you would want, having previously had such a big success, to go on to this, to being the main thing people are talking about this week. But that's one of the big stories I saw in the news this week, and we'll have to see where he goes from here. Indications are that he's going to stay at the head of the party. He's apologised and he's looking to move on. So we'll have to see how the DPP does in Parliament and what happens from there. So on to any other news, having moved aside from the political stuff. And what I want to talk about this week is the cancellation of New Year's Eve that's coming up in Shibuya and what that means for Japan. I think it's very interesting because previously there was these big iconic scenes you would see in sort of Halloween. You'd see a lot of people dressed up in elaborate costumes. They'd go out, they'd have a few drinks, and they'd appear in this like iconic Shibuya Square. I've been there previously as a tourist, not on Halloween for the scenes, but it was like sort of a big going on. But now, not only did they ban this for the coronavirus, they've banned it for Halloween this year, and now they're looking to ban it also for New Year's. The neighbourhood are, and there's been talk of sort of the amount of drinking and the amount of people and the amount of attention it gets sort of being a detraction. I suspect a lot of this is playing into, there's been a lot of sort of stories as a result of high tourism in Japan because the yen's so low, people are finally coming out of corona, and so they were looking to go travelling again, and with the yen being relatively low versus the dollar and the pound and the euro, it seemed like a good time to go, and a lot of people have had the same idea, and there's been a lot of touristification, a lot of people going over there and visiting, including myself in the last year, so I can't judge, of course. But it's very good for the economy, obviously, to have this major influx, and it's quite nice, in my opinion, that there's this interest in going to Japan and Japanese culture. Obviously, I hope everyone does it like respectfully and as careful as they can. I'm certainly made faux pas, and I'm not the perfect person when I've gone over there, but it's something you have to adjust to. But it seems perhaps because of the amount of crowds, partially from tourists, that this has been cancelled for the moment, which I think is a shame because it's such. You see photos of it. Shibuya is a very famous neighborhood, and these big iconic scenes of people out celebrating New Year's and Halloween in all these big elaborate costumes, and it's sort of like a display of joy and fun. And so it's sort of bittersweet because it's like good in a way that people are so interested in Japan, and there's such attention to go to these things, and people are so interested and want to go, but it's led to this sort of iconic event grinding to a halt for the moment, and we'll have to see how that develops. I think grappling with tourism is going to be an ongoing cultural, political, economic issue that Japan has to look at. But as we approach the New Year's, it's interesting that it's led to this very iconic event being sort of putting the shutdown on it a little bit and sort of trying to tamper the amount of festivities there. So it'd be interesting what goes on from there. Well, that just about draws this episode to a close, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast with your host, Luke Whitaker, and thank you so much for visiting us. Just to mention, if you're listening on YouTube, you can also find us in audio form on Spotify and iTunes. And to those listening online, you can also find us on YouTube, both the full episodes and short clips covering other issues as well on Japanese politics and Japan in general. So thank you so much for listening, everyone, and sayonara, goodbye.